History, when stripped of urgency, becomes something quieter. It stops rushing toward conclusions and instead begins to drift, like mist over still water. The world of Game of Thrones was never built to be hurried. It was shaped slowly, over centuries of imagined time, by choices that hardened into customs, by wars that faded into memory, and by names that outlived the people who first carried them. To understand this world is not to memorize its battles or count its crowns. It is to listen to the long echo of cause and consequence. Every betrayal rests upon an older promise. Every throne stands upon older bones. Westeros feels ancient because it behaves like real history. Power does not move cleanly from one ruler to the next. It lingers. It decays. It leaves stains that cannot be washed away by a single victory or a single death. What the land remembers, even when its people pretend not to. This story does not begin with dragons overhead or armies at the gate. It begins earlier, in silence, when the world was colder and stranger, and fear had not yet learned how to speak its own name. It begins with the slow formation of myths, and with truths buried beneath them. In Westeros, legend is simply history that has had enough time to soften its edges. As we move through this timeline, nothing will rush you forward. Events will unfold with the patience of snowfall. Names will return, not as surprises, but as familiar shapes reappearing in the dark. You will begin to feel how one age presses gently, but relentlessly upon the next. This is not a story about heroes conquering evil. It is about systems that endure longer than individuals, about houses that rise because others fall, about how even the most powerful people remain subject to forces they barely understand. Tradition, prophecy, fear, and memory. Listen not for drama, but for rhythm, for the steady heartbeat of a continent learning, again and again, the same difficult lessons. Empires do not collapse loudly. They fade, piece by piece, while everyone is looking somewhere else. So allow the world to settle around you. Let its winters lengthen. Let its histories overlap and blur. This is the complete timeline, told not to awaken you, but to gently carry you backward through time, until the noise quiets, the edges soften, and the long night feels distant enough to rest within. Long before crowns were forged, before banners learned their colors, before even the idea of a kingdom could settle into language, the world that would one day be called Westeros existed in a state that resisted structure. This was the Dawn Age, a period not measured in years or generations, but in atmosphere and sensation, a time when the land itself felt unfinished, as though it was still deciding what it wished to become. In the oldest accounts preserved within Game of Thrones, the Dawn Age is described not as peaceful, but as quiet. Silence, however, did not mean safety. It meant uncertainty. The continents were largely wilderness. Forests stretched uninterrupted for hundreds of miles, their canopies thick enough to dim the sun even at midday. Rivers followed ancient paths carved by retreating ice, and mountains rose sharply from the earth, young and jagged, unconcerned with whether they could be crossed. The seasons did not yet obey rules. Summers lingered too long, then vanished without warning. Winters arrived early, stayed late, and left scars behind. The first intelligent beings to leave a mark on this world did not arrive with ambition. They arrived with caution. They learned where to walk, where not to linger, and which sounds in the dark meant danger. Their lives were shaped not by politics, but by weather, hunger, and fear. These early inhabitants did not build cities. They shaped the land gently, almost apologetically. Their settlements blended into forests and hills, designed to avoid attention rather than attract it. This was a philosophy born from understanding something fundamental about the world, that it was larger, much older, and far less forgiving than any one people. What they feared most did not come from animals or storms, but from the cold itself. Not merely low temperatures, but the deep, penetrating cold that seemed to carry intention. A cold that arrived with silence rather than wind. A cold that felt aware. In later centuries, scholars would struggle to separate metaphor from memory when writing about this era. They would debate whether the fears described were symbolic or whether something truly watched from beyond the edges of known land. But in the Dawn Age, there was no such distinction. Fear did not require proof. It only required repetition. As generations passed, patterns began to form. Certain places were avoided instinctively. Certain caves were sealed, not with walls but with stories. Her parents taught their children not only how to hunt and gather, but how to listen. Which silences were natural, and which meant that something else was listening too. Eventually, humanity arrived. The first men crossed into this land not as conquerors, but as migrants driven by necessity. They brought with them tools of bronze, domesticated animals, and a way of life built around clearing land and claiming it. Where earlier inhabitants had adapted to the world, the first men sought to reshape it. Forests fell, sacred groves burned, rivers were redirected. At first, this was done out of ignorance rather than malice. The first men did not understand the delicate balance that had kept fear at bay. They only knew that survival required expansion. Conflict followed, not immediately, but inevitably. And when it did, it was slow and deeply personal. There were no vast armies, no formal declarations of war, only skirmishes in forests, poisoned streams, and ambushes beneath moonless skies. The land itself seemed to react. Winters grew harsher. Summers shortened. Animals migrated or vanished altogether. The nights became longer, and with them came stories of shapes moving where they should not be, of blue light flickering between trees, of dead things that did not remain dead. These accounts would later be dismissed by Meisters as exaggeration or as early attempts to explain natural disasters. But such dismissals say more about the comfort of later ages than the reality of the Dawn Age. When survival is fragile, the mind becomes attuned to danger in ways that civilized people often forget. Eventually, a fragile peace emerged, not because trust was built, but because fear became mutual. Walls were not yet raised, But boundaries were understood. Certain forests were left untouched. Certain rituals were performed not out of faith, but out of habit, because habit had kept people alive. It was during this uneasy balance that the world first began to remember itself, not through writing, but through oral tradition. Songs, carved symbols, and shared warnings passed down from one generation to the next. This was the beginning of history, though it would not yet be recognized as such. And beneath all of it lingered the cold, always waiting, always patient. The Dawn Age did not end with a single event. It faded slowly as knowledge accumulated and fear found names. But the threats it introduced never truly disappeared. They simply retreated, settling into the background of the world, where they could be forgotten until they were needed again. This is the quiet tragedy of early history. Not that people suffered, but that they learned just enough to feel safe. Enough to believe the darkness had been understood. Enough to think that what once watched from the far north would never return. As the ages turned, myths began to harden into legends, and legends into comfortable stories told beside warm fires. The land healed in places, scarred in others. Human settlements grew larger, louder, more confident, but the oldest fear remained unchanged, unimpressed by progress, unmoved by belief. The Dawn Age left behind no thrones, no laws, and no recorded victories. Only a lesson, half remembered and often ignored, that the world was never meant to belong entirely to those who lived upon it, and that some winters were never meant to end. The Long Night is not remembered as a war in the conventional sense. There are no reliable dates attached to it, no agreed upon duration, and no single account that can be trusted in full. What remains instead is a shared memory, fractured and uneven, preserved in different forms by different peoples, all circling the same central truth, that the world once came close to ending, not with fire or chaos, but with silence and cold. In the historical tradition of Game of Thrones, the Long Night exists in the uneasy space between myth and testimony. Maesters debate it cautiously, often reducing it to metaphor or seasonal catastrophe, yet even their skepticism carries an undertone of restraint. There are some stories that scholarship approaches slowly, not because they lack evidence, but because too much evidence exists, scattered across cultures that should have had no reason to agree, across Westeros and far beyond it. Different civilizations remember the same darkness under different names. The Rhoynar spoke of a night without dawn. In the Far East, priests recorded a time when the sun hid its face for a generation. Among the first men, the tales are simpler, more restrained, and therefore more unsettling. The cold came, and it did not leave. The world changed gradually at first. Summers shortened. Harvests failed earlier each year. Animals grew scarce, then desperate. Snow fell in places that had never known it before. Thin at first, then deep enough to alter the land itself. Rivers froze not just at the edges, but entirely, becoming pale roads of ice that carried danger as easily as trade once had. But what separated the Long Night from ordinary hardship was not its severity, but its persistence. Human memory is resilient when it can measure suffering against an endpoint. The long night offered no such comfort. Each winter felt final. Each dawn arrived weaker than the one before it. It was during this time that fear became organized. The stories speak of figures emerging from the far north, where the land gives way to endless ice and the sky seems closer to the earth. They were not invaders in the usual sense. They did not raid settlements for wealth or territory. They advanced slowly, deliberately, leaving absence in their wake rather than ruin. These beings would later be called the Others. Descriptions of them vary, but certain details remain consistent across centuries of retelling. They were pale, almost reflective, as if carved from moonlight and frost. Their eyes shone with a cold intelligence that did not burn, but froze. They did not speak, yet they communicated unmistakably. This world was not meant for warmth anymore. More disturbing than their presence was their influence. The dead did not rest. Those who fell in the cold rose again, not as themselves, but as extensions of something larger, something patient. This was not resurrection in the religious sense. It was occupation. Communities learned quickly that traditional defenses were meaningless. Walls slowed nothing. Weapons shattered against ice that did not behave like ice should. Fire offered temporary relief, but demanded constant vigilance. And vigilance itself became exhausting. In a world where sleep meant vulnerability, the long night forced humanity into smaller and smaller circles of trust. Large settlements collapsed first, unable to feed themselves or defend their borders. Survivors fled into caves, dense forests and high ground, anywhere that offered even the illusion of safety. Family units became the primary structure of survival. Loyalty narrowed. Suspicion widened. It is important to understand that during the long night, hope did not disappear all at once. It eroded. At first, people believed the cold would pass, as it always had. Then they believed it would pass if they endured long enough. Eventually, endurance itself became the goal. To live one more day. To keep one fire burning through one more night. In this environment, belief systems hardened. The old gods, once vague and local, became urgent. Sacrifices were made not to ask for favor, but to acknowledge fear. The act of worship became less about reverence and more about recognition. Something vast was watching, and ignoring it felt dangerous. It was also during this time that the idea of heroes took shape. Not heroes as conquerors or rulers, but as figures who understood something others did not. Men and women who recognized patterns in the darkness. Who learned which weapons slowed the cold and which only angered it. Who realized that survival required cooperation across boundaries that had once defined identity. One name, repeated in different forms across different cultures, rises above the rest. A figure remembered not for victory but for resolve. The tales differ, but they agree on this. When despair had settled into permanence, someone chose to resist not with force alone, but with understanding. Whether this figure truly existed as a single individual matters less than what the stories convey. The long night did not end because the darkness was destroyed. It ended because it was pushed back, contained, limited. The turning point, as remembered, was subtle. There was no final battle witnessed by all. Instead, the cold began to hesitate. Dawns grew marginally brighter. The dead stopped rising as frequently. The silence retreated. Not quickly, but noticeably. When the first true sunrise came, it was not celebrated with triumph. It was met with disbelief. People waited for it to fade. They watched the horizon carefully, unsure whether the light was real or another deception. Only after seasons returned to something resembling order did rebuilding begin, and even then, it was cautious. The world had proven itself capable of betrayal. But the legacy of the long night shaped everything that followed. Architecture changed. Defensive structures were built not against human enemies, but against memory. The Great Wall, raised in the far north, was not simply a fortification. It was a statement of fear made permanent, an admission carved into ice and stone that what came before could come again. More importantly, history itself changed. Knowledge was no longer treated as optional. Warnings were preserved. Stories were repeated not for entertainment, but for instruction. The idea that the past could be safely ignored lost credibility. And yet, over time, even the long night softened in the collective mind. As generations passed without its return, urgency faded. The wall became a boundary rather than a reminder. The others became monsters of legend, as suitable for frightening children, but not for shaping policy. This is the final irony of the long night. It taught the world caution, and then trusted the world to remember that lesson without reinforcement. Some did. Most did not. The darkness retreated, but it was never undone. It learned, as humanity did. It waited, as humanity forgot. And so the long night ended not with closure, but with suspension. A pause in a much longer cycle. A reminder embedded so deeply into myth that it could be dismissed as fantasy, right up until the moment it no longer was. In the chapters that follow, kingdoms will rise. Names will gain power. Wars will be fought for reasons that seem immediate and urgent. But beneath all of it, beneath every banner and every crown, lies the quiet inheritance of the long night. A memory of cold, a fear without shape, and the knowledge that history, when ignored long enough, has a way of returning. When the long night finally loosened its grip on the world, it did not leave behind clarity. It left exhaustion. Survivors emerged into a landscape altered not only by cold, but by memory. Forests had shifted. Rivers had changed their courses. Entire valleys stood empty where voices had once lived. The light had returned, but confidence had not followed it. This was the beginning of what later generations would call the Age of Heroes, though those who lived through it would not have recognized the name. They did not think of themselves as heroic. They thought of themselves as careful. In the historical imagination of Game of Thrones, the Age of Heroes occupies a peculiar space. It is remembered with reverence, yet described with uncertainty. Names from this era are repeated often, but details blur. Deeds grow larger with each retelling, yet while motives quietly simplify. This is the nature of foundational history. It becomes symbolic, before it becomes accurate. The world that emerged from the long night demanded new structures. Fear alone could no longer organize survival. People needed continuity. They needed places that could outlast individual lives. And so, they began to build. The first great constructions of Westeros were not born of ambition, but of anxiety. Stone replaced wood because wood burned and rotted too easily. Settlements moved away from purely defensive positions toward locations that allowed for trade, communication, and visibility. Height became important, not to dominate, but to see. Castles in their earliest forms were not palaces. They were shelters with memory. Each wall was raised with the understanding that something worse than human enemies had once tested the world. Thickness mattered more than beauty. Durability mattered more than comfort. It was during this era that certain families began to emerge as anchors of stability, not because they were stronger than others, but because they endured. They learned when to fight and when to wait. They preserved knowledge, rituals, and warnings passed down from the long night. Over time, these families became houses. The concept of rulership in the Age of Heroes differed greatly from what would come later. Kings were not crowned by divine right or conquest alone. They were recognized because they provided safety. Authority was local, personal, and conditional. A king who could not protect his people did not remain king for long. At this period gave rise to figures whose names would echo for thousands of years. Builders, warriors, and lawgivers, whose accomplishments were so foundational that later societies struggled to imagine a world without them. But it is important to note how these figures are remembered. They are remembered as solitary. The Age of Heroes, as told in legend, often centers on individuals acting alone against impossible odds. A single builder raising an impossible wall, a single king uniting a fractured land, a single warrior standing against the darkness. In reality, survival required cooperation. No great structure was built by one set of hands. No kingdom formed without compromise. But myth prefers clarity over accuracy. It reduces complexity to character. Take the great works attributed to this era. The wall, said to stretch impossibly across the northern edge of the world, is remembered as the vision of a single mind. Winterfell, ancient and layered with history, is described as though it rose fully formed from the earth. Storm's End, with its defiance of wind and sea, is credited to resolve rather than engineering. These stories persist not because they are factual, but because they are useful. They offer the comfort of intention. They suggest that the world after the long night was shaped deliberately by people who understood what they were doing. The truth is quieter. Much of what survived did so by accident. Some structures endured because they were overbuilt out of fear. Some traditions lasted because no one dared change them. The Age of Heroes was less about mastery and more about restraint. This was also the age in which law began to take recognizable form. After generations of survival through instinct, people began to codify behavior. Rules were not written to ensure fairness, but to prevent chaos. Hospitality laws, for example, emerged not from kindness, but from necessity. In a world still recovering from near extinction, the ability to pass safely through another's land was a matter of life and death. Breaking such laws was not merely rude, it was dangerous. It threatened the fragile trust that allowed civilization to exist at all. Religion, too, is settled into more defined shapes during this time. The old gods, once tied to specific groves and stones, became more symbolic. They represented continuity rather than intervention. They did not promise protection, only observation. This distinction mattered. A god who watches does not prevent disaster. A god who watches ensures that disaster is remembered. The Age of Heroes also marked the slow transition from shared fear to inherited power. Children born after the Long Night grew up hearing about it rather than experiencing it. For them, the darkness was a story, not a sensation. They respected the old warnings but did not feel them in their bones. This generational shift changed leadership. Where earlier rulers governed cautiously, always aware of what had nearly been lost, later ones began to test boundaries. They expanded territory, but they asserted dominance. They sought legacy. This is where the Age of Heroes begins to reveal its most enduring contradiction. It is remembered as a time of unity, yet it laid the groundwork for division. As houses grew stronger, they grew more distinct. As borders stabilized, they hardened. What began as cooperation slowly transformed into hierarchy. And hierarchy, once established, seeks permanence. By the end of the Age of Heroes, Westeros was no longer a collection of wary survivors. It was a land of emerging kingdoms, each with its own identity, its own history, and its own interpretation of the past. The Long Night had become distant enough to be interpreted rather than feared. Heroes became symbols rather than teachers. Their stories were told not to warn, but to inspire. The uncomfortable truths, the compromises, the failures, but the collective effort were smoothed away. This is how foundational lies are born. Not lies of malice, but lies of simplification, the kind that make history easier to carry, even if they make it less accurate. The Age of Heroes did not end with a collapse or a conquest. It ended with confidence, with the belief that the world was now understood, that the worst had passed, that the structures in place were sufficient. It was this belief, more than any enemy, that shaped the ages to come. Because when people believe the darkness has been defeated forever, they stop watching the edges of the world. They stop listening for the old silences. They stop teaching their children why the walls were built so thick, or why the stories were once spoken in whispers. The heroes were real, in the sense that people endured and built and remembered. But the age that bears their name is also the moment when humanity began to trust permanence. And history, patient as ever, waited for the opportunity to remind them otherwise. The transition from the Age of Heroes into the era that followed was not marked by a single catastrophe or revelation. Instead, it arrived gradually, carried across the narrow sea by people who believed, quietly, firmly, that the world belonged to those strong enough to shape it. They were the Andals. Unlike the first men, who had crossed into Westeros out of necessity, the Andals came with intention. They arrived not as refugees, but as believers. They carried steel weapons that did not dull as easily as bronze, armor that held its shape, and perhaps most significantly, a unified faith that gave their expansion moral clarity. In the long memory preserved within Game of Thrones, the Andal invasions are often summarized as a wave of conquest, yet conquest alone does not explain their lasting impact. Many invaders before them had landed on Westerosi shores. None reshaped its identity so thoroughly. The Andals did not merely defeat their enemies, they replaced them. Their arrival began along the eastern coasts and riverlands, where contact was easiest and resistance fragmented. At first, their presence was tolerated. Trade followed conflict, as it often does. Steel was admired. New customs were observed with curiosity rather than fear. But curiosity rarely remains neutral. The Andals brought with them the faith of the Seven, a religion markedly different from the old gods of the forests. Where the old gods watched silently, the Seven judged. They defined morality, hierarchy, and order in clear terms. They offered explanations for suffering and promised structure in return for obedience. This clarity was powerful, and in a world still unsettled by ancient fear, many found comfort in rules that claimed universality. The Seven did not belong to groves or regions. They belonged everywhere. And if they belonged everywhere, then so did those who spoke in their name. The first wars between Andals and the descendants of the first men were uneven, but not always decisive. In some regions, resistance was fierce. Ancient houses fought to preserve their customs, their gods, and their claim to land shaped by generations of memory. In other places, surrender came quietly. It is easy to assume that faith was imposed at sword point, but this is only part of the story. The faith spread because it aligned with power. It legitimized conquest. It sanctified hierarchy. It offered newly risen lords a divine framework through which to justify rule. For many, their conversion was not betrayal. It was adaptation. The old gods demanded memory. The Seven offered belonging. As the Andals settled, they rebuilt the landscape in their image. Sacred trees were cut down, not always out of hatred, but out of indifference. Stone septs rose where weirwoods once stood. Language shifted. Laws were rewritten. Perhaps the most profound change was the introduction of written tradition on a wider scale. The Andals valued records, lineage, and codified law. Genealogy became a tool of authority. History became something that could be edited. This marked a turning point in Westerosi culture. Before the Andals, memory was communal. Stories lived because they were repeated. After them, memory became institutional. What was written gained permanence. What was not began to fade. This process did not erase the first men entirely. In the north, geography itself resisted transformation. The forests were too vast, the winters too long, the people too deeply bound to old customs to abandon them easily. There, the old gods endured. But even in the north, change crept in. Steel replaced bronze. Marriage alliances blended bloodlines. Titles evolved, and no culture remains untouched when surrounded. The Andal invasions were not a single moment, but a long pressure applied unevenly across centuries. Some regions transformed quickly. Others absorbed changes so gradually that the transition felt natural. even inevitable. What was lost during this time is difficult to quantify. Songs disappeared. Local traditions were absorbed into broader customs. Ancient names were forgotten or altered to fit new tongues. The quiet, localized spirituality of the old gods was pushed to the margins, treated as superstition rather than belief. This is the nature of cultural erasure when it is successful. It does not announce itself. It simply replaces. Yet the Andals did not bring only destruction. They brought stability of a different kind. Clear hierarchies reduced internal conflict. Unified law simplified governance. Shared belief eased cooperation between distant regions. For many, life became more predictable. Predictability, however, carries its own cost. As the faith of the Seven grew more influential, it began to shape morality in rigid terms. Complex realities were simplified into virtue and sin. Justice became performative. Authority was no longer merely practical, it was sacred. This alignment between faith and power would echo throughout Westerosi history. Once rule is declared holy, rebellion becomes heresy. Once obedience is framed as virtue, dissent becomes dangerous. The Age of Heroes had relied on memory to guide behavior. The Andal era relied on doctrine, and doctrine, unlike memory, resists nuance. By the time the invasions slowed and borders stabilized, Westeros was no longer the land that had emerged from the long night. It was a mosaic of regions unified not by shared origin, but by shared structure. Kings ruled by inheritance rather than recognition. Faith validated authority. Law replaced instinct. The world felt safer, more ordered. But beneath that order lay unresolved tension. The old gods still watched from the trees. The north still remembered winter differently. And the land itself, shaped by older forces than any invasion, retained its capacity for indifference. The Andals believed they had brought civilization to Westeros. In truth, they had brought interpretation. They taught the land how to explain itself. And in doing so, they ensured that when the next great power arrived, one born not of faith or steel, but of fire, the world would already be accustomed to reshaping its past to justify its present. The story of fire in Westeros does not begin on its shores. It begins far to the east, in a land that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. A place remembered more for what it unleashed than for what it was. Valyria was not a kingdom in the familiar Westerosi tradition. It was an experiment in domination over nature, over life, and over fear itself. Where other civilizations learned to adapt to the world's dangers, Valyria sought to command them. Its power did not arise from faith or memory, but from mastery. The Valyrians discovered dragons. Whether discovery is the correct word remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest dragons were tamed. Others imply they were created or bound through means later ages chose not to preserve. What matters is not how the bond began, but what it allowed. Dragons turned geography into a suggestion rather than a limitation. Mountains no longer protected borders. Cities no longer relied on walls. Fire erased distance. With dragons, Valyria expanded rapidly, absorbing rival cultures into a growing empire that prized bloodlines above all else. Power was inherited not merely through name, but through the ability to ride and command these creatures. This distinction mattered. It meant authority was biological, not symbolic. Rulers were not chosen by gods or councils. They were born. To preserve this power, Valyrian society became inward-facing and rigid. Families intermarried to keep their blood pure. Traditions were enforced with quiet brutality. Innovation served expansion, not ethics. Slavery underpinned the empire, treated not as moral failing, but as logistical necessity. For centuries, yet this system worked. Valyria's dominance reshaped entire regions. Roads, laws, and trade routes bent toward it. The world learned to accommodate fire. And then, without warning, Valyria ended. The doom of Valyria is remembered not as a battle or rebellion, but as a rupture. The land itself turned against its masters. Volcanoes erupted. Cities collapsed. The sky filled with ash. Whatever forces had once been controlled were released, indiscriminate and final. The empire did not fall. It was erased. In the wake of the doom, the world recalibrated. Dragon lords vanished almost entirely. Knowledge was lost. Power fragmented. What remained of Valyria existed only as ruins and warning. Except for one family. The Targaryens were not the greatest of the Valyrian houses. They were not the most ambitious, nor the most respected. They survived not because of strength, but because of distance. Years before the doom, they had relocated to Dragonstone, a bleak island fortress off the eastern coast of Westeros. At the time, this move was seen as retreat. In hindsight, it was preservation. On Dragonstone, the Targaryens waited. They watched the world adjust to Valyria's absence. They listened as new powers rose, each convinced that fire had left the world for good. It had not. Westeros, at this point, was divided and stable in equal measure. 7 kingdoms existed in uneasy balance, shaped by Andal law, First Men tradition, and centuries of localized rule. Wars occurred, but they were limited. Power shifted slowly. This made the land vulnerable. When Aegon Targaryen finally turned his attention westward, he did not come as a conqueror driven by desperation. He came with patience, with calculation, with an understanding of fear. Aegon's invasion was not large by conventional standards. His armies were modest. His resources limited. But what he possessed instead was narrative control. Dragons returned to a world that had begun to doubt their reality. The psychological impact was immediate. Castles built to withstand sieges crumbled under fire from above. Armies trained for generations to face steel broke formation in terror. Resistance became a calculation rather than a principle. Some kings fought and died. Others bent the knee without battle. Not out of cowardice, but recognition. They understood that the world had changed shape again. The Targaryens framed their conquest not as destruction, but as unification. They offered peace in exchange for submission. They preserved local customs where convenient. They ruled from above, distant and overwhelming, rather than entangled in regional disputes. The Iron Throne itself symbolized this philosophy. They're forged from the swords of defeated enemies. It was not designed for comfort. It was a reminder. Rule was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be endured. Under Targaryen rule, Westeros entered a new era of centralized power. The faith was negotiated with rather than eradicated. The North was allowed its gods and customs in exchange for loyalty. Old houses retained their lands, but not their sovereignty. Fire had imposed order. Yet fire, by its nature, consumes indiscriminately. Over time, the dragons dwindled. Some died in war. Others grew smaller with each generation. The bloodlines that sustained them thinned. The very practices meant to preserve power began to weaken it. The Targaryens remained rulers, but their foundation shifted. What began as dominance through fear evolved into governance through tradition. Dragons became symbols rather than weapons. Myth replaced immediacy. This transition carried risk. As memory of Valyria faded, so did understanding of its limits. Later, Targaryens inherited crowns without inheriting caution. They ruled a land united by fire, but maintained by compromise. And compromise is fragile when authority rests on legacy rather than presence. Still, for a time, the system held. The realm knew peace not because it was just, but because it was centralized. Rebellions were rare and borders stabilized. History seemed to settle into predictability. This is the illusion that fire creates. That destruction, once complete, results in permanence. But the Targaryen dynasty carried within it the same contradiction that doomed Valyria. Power concentrated too narrowly. Blood elevated above adaptability. Tradition mistaken for inevitability. The dragons were gone. The memory of them remained. And in that space between fear and forgetting, the seeds of collapse were quietly taking root. Westeros had been unified by fire. It would not be fire that broke it, but something slower, subtler, and far more familiar. Human ambition. The Iron Throne did not emerge as a symbol of triumph. It emerged as a solution. In the years following Aegon's conquest, Westeros required more than obedience. It required coherence. The Seven Kingdoms had bent the knee, but bending is not the same as belonging. Old rivalries lingered beneath the surface, quiet but unresolved, waiting for opportunity. Aegon understood that conquest alone does not create a realm. It merely clears the space in which one might exist. So the early Targaryen rule focused not on celebration, but on reinforcement. The Iron Throne was forged from the weapons of defeated kings, melted down and reshaped into something deliberately inhospitable. Its jagged edges were not decorative. They served as constant reminder that power in this new order was not inherited from tradition or faith, but seized through force and maintained through vigilance. In the political memory preserved by Game of Thrones, the throne itself becomes almost mythic, but its original purpose was practical. It was never meant to be sat upon comfortably. Discomfort was the point. Rule was to be felt, not enjoyed. Aegon ruled lightly in daily matters, but absolutely in principle. He allowed local lords to keep their lands, their customs, even their titles. What he took from them was something far more valuable: the right to wage independent war. This decision reshaped Westeros more profoundly than fire ever could. Before the Targaryens, war was a tool of negotiation. Houses asserted claims through violence as naturally as through marriage. Under the Iron Throne, war became treason unless sanctioned from above. Conflict was centralized, controlled, or delayed. Peace followed, not because grievances disappeared, but because they were forced into silence. The early reigns of House Targaryen were marked by careful balance. The faith of the Seven was neither destroyed nor elevated beyond control. Aegon understood belief as a stabilizing force, but only when contained. Agreements were struck. Symbols were exchanged. The faith was allowed authority over souls, but not over crowns. The North was treated differently. Recognizing its distance, its harsh climate, and its stubborn memory, Aegon granted it concessions others did not receive. The old gods were tolerated. Northern lords were left largely to govern themselves, so long as loyalty remained intact. This was not generosity. It was pragmatism. The wall still stood. The North still remembered winter as something more than inconvenience. And Aegon, for all his fire, respected forces that predated him. As the years passed, the machinery of centralized rule took shape. Laws were standardized. Coinage unified trade. Roads connected regions that had once felt foreign to one another. The realm began to think of itself as singular. But unity achieved through fear carries its own cost. The Iron Throne depended heavily on the presence of dragons. Their shadows enforced obedience even when they were not deployed. The knowledge that resistance could be erased from the sky discouraged rebellion before it formed. As dragons began to vanish, that balance shifted. The Targaryens attempted to replace fear with tradition. Ceremony grew more elaborate, lineage more emphasized. The idea of divine right crept slowly into governance, not because it was believed, but because it was useful. This transition marked a subtle weakening of authority. Fear is immediate. Tradition is abstract. Without dragons, the throne relied increasingly on loyalty that could not be compelled as easily. Compromise replaced command. Marriage alliances became tools of stabilization. Political maneuvering replaced open dominance. The Iron Throne endured, but its nature changed. Those who followed Aegon inherited his crown without inheriting his clarity. Some governed wisely, understanding restraint. Others mistook submission for devotion and silence for agreement. The dance of the dragons would later expose these weaknesses, but the seeds were planted here in the early years of unification. When power is centralized too completely, every fracture matters. Every succession becomes dangerous. Every personal flaw becomes political. Still, for generations, Westeros functioned. Its people born under the Iron Throne grew up believing this order was natural. They knew only one king. They thought of rebellion as history, not possibility. Peace became ordinary, and ordinary things are rarely questioned. This is the quiet success of centralized power. It convinces those living beneath it that no alternative exists. Yet beneath that calm, the old structures remained. Houses still remembered past grievances. Regions still differed in belief and identity. The faith still held influence. The North still watched the cold. The Iron Throne did not erase these differences. It simply pressed them down, holding them in point through shared fear and habit. Over time, the throne became less a warning and more a prize, something to be desired rather than endured. And when power becomes desirable, ambition follows. Yet the unification of Westeros succeeded not because it healed division, but because it delayed its consequences. For a time, fear was enough. For a time, order held. But order built on memory of fire weakens as that memory fades. And when it does, the throne that once unified a realm becomes the center of every conflict within it. The Iron Throne was forged to end war. In doing so, it ensured that when war returned, it would be total. Dynasties rarely collapse from a single blow. They weaken gradually from within as the distance between power and responsibility grows too wide to bridge. By the time the cracks are visible to everyone, they have usually been forming for generations. For House Targaryen, the period following the consolidation of the Iron Throne was marked not by immediate decline, but by subtle distortion. The mechanisms that once ensured stability, bloodline, tradition, centralized authority, began to work against one another. What had unified the realm now demanded constant maintenance. Within the historical framework of Game of Thrones, this era is often compressed into a series of dramatic reigns. Mad kings, great rebellions, tragic heirs. Yet when viewed as a continuum, the pattern is quieter and more instructive. But the first great fracture emerged from succession. When power is absolute, succession becomes everything. Every uncertainty invites challenge. Every disagreement becomes existential. As dragons disappeared and authority grew more symbolic, the question of who should rule began to matter more than how they ruled. The dance of the dragons was not merely a civil war. It was a revelation. For the first time, the realm saw that Targaryen power could be turned inward, that dragons could burn Westerosi fields as easily as foreign cities. The war devastated both land and lineage. By its end, the dragons were all but gone, and with them the dynasty's greatest advantage. What remained was a throne without teeth. From that point forward, the Targaryens ruled by inertia. Their name still commanded respect, but it no longer inspired fear. Their kings came and went. Some were competent, others indifferent. A few were dangerously unstable. The idea of exceptional blood, once justified by dragonfire, began to manifest as isolation. Targaryens married within their own family, not to preserve power, but to protect identity. This practice narrowed perspective. It reinforced the belief that rulers were fundamentally different from those they governed. Distance grew. The court became insulated. Counselors filtered reality. Criticism was interpreted as disloyalty. In such an environment, paranoia flourishes naturally. Over time, the line between vigilance and obsession blurred. By the reign of Aerys II, later remembered as the Mad King, the accumulated stress of generations found expression in a single individual. Aerys did not begin his rule as a tyrant. He was cautious, even hopeful. But power without grounding amplifies insecurity. He came to see threats everywhere. Lords who questioned him became traitors. Friends became potential conspirators. Fire, once a symbol of conquest, became a personal fixation. The realm responded not with immediate rebellion, but with hesitation. Loyalty had been conditioned over centuries. People waited, hoping stability would return. It did not. The final breaking point arrived not through ideology, but through personal violation. When royal authority crossed into cruelty without purpose, patience collapsed. Robert's rebellion, as it would later be called, was not born from a desire to dismantle monarchy. It emerged from the belief that this king, specifically, had forfeited legitimacy. The rebellion united houses that had little in common beyond exhaustion. What followed was swift and brutal. Battles were decisive. The crown's forces fractured. When King's Landing fell, it was not merely a military defeat. It was a symbolic one. The Targaryen dynasty, which had ruled Westeros for nearly 3 centuries, ended not with fire, but with disintegration. The surviving members fled across the narrow sea, carrying with them memory rather than power. The dragons were gone. The throne passed to a new house. Yet the Iron Throne itself remained. This is the enduring lesson of dynastic collapse. Systems often outlive the families that build them, as the structure of centralized rule persisted, even as its originators vanished. Robert Baratheon's reign restored surface stability, but it did not resolve the underlying contradictions. The throne was now held by someone who had won it through war rather than legacy. This changed the narrative, but not the mechanics of power. Old grievances resurfaced quietly. The faith watched. The North remembered. The idea that kings could be removed by force lodged itself permanently in the political imagination. The realm entered a new phase, one defined less by dragons and destiny, and more by human weakness. The cracks in the dynasty had become cracks in the system itself, and while peace returned, it did so without conviction. It rested on the assumption that the past had been resolved, that the worst excesses were behind them, yes, that the throne had learned restraint. History would prove otherwise, because once a realm accepts that power can be seized, it must also accept that it can be contested, and once that idea takes root, it does not fade easily. The Targaryens were gone, the Iron Throne endured, and the age that followed would test whether unity built on conquest could survive without fear to hold it together. The reign that followed the fall of House Targaryen did not announce itself as a new age. It presented itself as a correction. After years of paranoia, fire, and rebellion, the realm desired rest more than reform. When Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne, he did so not as a visionary ruler, but as a symbol of release. His victory promised an end to fear, and for a time, that promise was enough. In the historical memory shaped by Game of Thrones, Robert's rule is often summarized by excess: feasts, hunts, carelessness. Yet beneath the surface of indulgence lay a deeper pattern, one that explains why the peace he oversaw felt solid while remaining fundamentally fragile. Robert did not govern in the manner of conquerors or reformers. He delegated. He trusted old alliances, Yet he allowed the machinery of rule to continue functioning as it always had. In this, he was effective. The realm was tired. And fatigue makes stability feel like success. Under Robert, the Seven Kingdoms experienced few open conflicts. Borders held. Trade continued. The small folk lived lives that, while still difficult, were not defined by constant war. Compared to the terror of the Mad King's final years, this calm felt profound. But calm is not the same as health. Robert's rule relied heavily on personal relationships forged during rebellion. Loyalty was assumed rather than cultivated. Those who had fought beside him were rewarded with influence, regardless of aptitude. The court became less a center of governance and more a gathering of survivors clinging to shared memory. This worked only as long as that memory remained vivid. As years passed, the rebellion receded into story. New generations rose without first-hand knowledge of why Robert ruled. They inherited titles, not purpose. At the center of the realm, the Iron Throne remained unchanged. Its sharp edges no longer warned of fire, but they still demanded vigilance. Robert, however, had little patience for vigilance. He saw the throne as a burden rather than a responsibility. Governance bored him. Paperwork, compromise, and foresight held no appeal. He preferred the simplicity of the past, where enemies were visible and victory was immediate. As a result, power drifted. Real authority passed quietly into the hands of those willing to manage it. Councils advised. Treasuries were handled by others. Decisions were made slowly, often with competing interests left unresolved. But the most significant of these unresolved tensions lay in succession. Robert's marriage was political, not personal. It produced heirs, but not unity. The royal household became a place of quiet resentment rather than shared purpose. Appearances were maintained, but trust was absent. This absence mattered. In a centralized system, the ruler's family is not merely private, it is symbolic. Cracks there reverberate outward, even if they remain unspoken. The North, meanwhile, remained distant but loyal. Its lord served out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. The old gods still watched. Winter was still taken seriously. The wall still stood. This regional contrast highlighted a truth the realm preferred not to confront. Unity was administrative, not emotional. People obeyed the crown, but they did not feel bound to it. Robert's greatest success was also his greatest failure. He made the throne feel safe again, safe enough that scrutiny faded, safe enough that ambition could grow unnoticed. Debts accumulated, alliances shifted. Old rivalries reawakened beneath polite surfaces. The mechanisms of power continued operating, but without oversight, they began to serve themselves. The king hunted. The court whispered. This imbalance did not cause immediate disaster. It simply prepared the conditions for it. By the time Robert's health declined, the realm was deeply unprepared for transition. The illusion of stability had masked structural weakness. No clear plan existed for managing conflict without the unifying figure of a victorious rebel king. When Robert died, the peace did not shatter instantly. It hesitated. People waited. They expected continuity. They believed the system would absorb the loss. as it had absorbed others before. But Robert's reign had not strengthened the throne. It had softened it. Without fear, without reverence, and without reform, the Iron Throne became what it had always risked becoming, a prize. And prizes invite competition. As the realm adjusted to a king who had been absent long before his death, the structures beneath him revealed their fragility. Authority was questioned, loyalty recalculated, truth became dangerous. The calm of Robert's reign was real, but it was conditional. It depended on neglect. It depended on memory. It depended on the hope that nothing would test it. History, however, rarely leaves such hopes unchallenged. The stage was set, not for revolution, but for fragmentation. Not for ideology, but for opportunism. The illusion of stability had done its work. The War of the Five Kings did not begin with a declaration. It emerged from uncertainty, from questions asked too quietly for too long, and from answers that arrived too late to matter. When Robert Baratheon died, the realm did not immediately descend into chaos. It paused, as if waiting for instruction. That pause was the war's true beginning. In the political landscape of Game of Thrones, this conflict is often framed as a struggle among claimants. 5 crowns raised, 5 banners unfurled, 5 kings declared. But focusing on the claimants obscures the deeper reality. This war was not about who should rule. It was about whether the idea of rule still held meaning. The Iron Throne had lost its authority long before it lost its king. What remained was habit. When questions of legitimacy surfaced, quietly, dangerously, the answers fractured along familiar lines. The realm had been unified through fear, then maintained through inertia. Now it faced a problem it had not prepared for: competing truths. In the capital, succession followed procedure, but not belief. The crown passed smoothly in form, yet uneasily in substance. Whispers of illegitimacy spread not because people sought rebellion, but because the silence around power invited speculation. Where certainty is absent, rumor becomes governance. In the north, loyalty took a different shape. There, oaths were remembered personally. Honor was not abstract. When trust was violated, response followed not from ambition, but from obligation. Elsewhere, ambition spoke more clearly. Old houses, long constrained by centralized authority, sensed opportunity. Some raised banners out of conviction. Others did so because delay felt dangerous. In times of collapse, neutrality is often interpreted as weakness. Thus, the realm divided, not cleanly, but unevenly. Alliances formed and dissolved with unsettling speed. Promises were made that could not be kept. Marches and countermarches carved uncertainty into the land. What distinguished this war from earlier conflicts was its fragmentation. There was no single front, no shared understanding of victory. Each king fought for a different vision of legitimacy, and those visions could not be reconciled. For the small folk, the distinction was meaningless. Armies moved regardless of banners. Fields burned regardless of cause. The war revealed a truth often hidden by politics. Centralized power collapses outward, but suffering collapses inward. As the conflict deepened, old rules eroded. Hospitality laws were broken, sacred spaces violated. Actions once considered unthinkable became justifiable under the language of necessity. This erosion mattered more than any single battle. The War of the Five Kings dismantled trust faster than it dismantled armies. Every betrayal widened the gap between memory and expectation. The stories people told themselves about order no longer matched experience. Even victory, when achieved, felt incomplete. Kings fell, crowns shattered. Yet stability did not return. Each resolution created new grievances. Each peace was temporary, conditional, and deeply fragile. The Iron Throne, once the anchor of the realm, became distant from the war's reality. It was fought over in theory, but the conflict itself revealed how little it governed in practice. Authority had diffused into regional power, personal loyalty, and raw survival. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the war was psychological. The realm learned that collapse could be ordinary, that order was not inevitable, that the stories of permanence inherited from earlier ages were just that, stories. When the war finally slowed, it did not end cleanly. It exhausted itself. The land was depleted. The people were wary. No single narrative emerged to explain what had been lost. In the aftermath, Westeros did not rebuild immediately. It waited. It watched. It tried to remember which lessons were worth carrying forward. But the war had changed the rhythm of history. It accelerated decay. It exposed how thin the veneer of unity had always been. And as the realm looked inward, counting its losses and measuring its scars, something else stirred beyond its borders. Something older than kings. Something patient. The war had consumed attention, and in doing so, it had recreated the oldest mistake of all, believing that human conflict was the only force that mattered. The end of a long history rarely feels like an ending to those who live within it. It arrives without ceremony, without clarity, and often without agreement. In Westeros, the final convergence of fire and ice did not resolve the past so much as reveal it, stripping away the comfort of old explanations and leaving behind something quieter and less certain. By the time the realm reached this final threshold, it was already exhausted. The War of the Five Kings had hollowed the land. Trust was scarce. Authority had fractured into regional power and personal survival. The Iron Throne still existed, but it no longer anchored meaning. It was a symbol without consensus, an object rather than an idea. It was in this condition, tired, divided, inward-looking, that the oldest threat returned. In the world of Game of Thrones, the return of the cold is not framed as a surprise. It is framed as inevitability. The signs had always been present, woven into stories, rituals, and warnings passed down through centuries. They were simply ignored when they became inconvenient. The others did not return with spectacle. They advanced as they always had, quietly, steadily, without urgency. They did not seek to rule. They did not negotiate. They erased. What made this moment different from the long night of legend was not the threat itself, but the world it encountered. This was no longer a land of scattered survivors, bound by shared fear. It was a continent shaped by hierarchy, pride, and accumulated grievance. Unity, when it finally came, did not arise from loyalty to the throne. It emerged from necessity, and from the recognition that political disputes lose meaning when existence itself is threatened. Old enemies stood beside one another, not because forgiveness had been achieved, but because alternatives had vanished. Faith mattered less than fire. Lineage mattered less than endurance. In this convergence, the ancient balance of Westeros reasserted itself. Ice returned to remind the world of its limits. Fire answered, not as domination, but as resistance. Dragons, long reduced to myth and memory, re-entered history not as symbols of empire, but as tools against extinction. Their presence did not restore the Targaryen dynasty's old authority. It underscored how narrow that authority had always been. Fire could destroy cities. It could not build consensus. The struggle against the cold did not unfold as a single defining battle. It occurred across nights and landscapes, in moments of courage that were rarely witnessed and often unrecorded. Victory, such as it was, felt less like triumph and more like reprieve. The darkness did not end because it was fully understood. It ended because it was pushed back, once again, by collective effort rather than singular heroism. And when it was over, the world did not return to what it had been. This is the final truth Westerosi history reveals. There is no restoration, only continuation, altered by what has been endured. In the aftermath, the realm faced a question it had long avoided. What comes after stories? For centuries, legitimacy had been justified through conquest, bloodline, prophecy, and fear. Each explanation eventually failed. Each collapsed under the weight of human imperfection. What remained was something smaller, quieter, and more fragile. Governance shifted away from absolute symbols and toward shared responsibility. Power became less theatrical. Decisions were slower, less dramatic, and less certain. This lack of certainty was not weakness. It was honesty. The North returned to its rhythms, still wary of winter. The South rebuilt, not with confidence, but with caution. The faith adapted, having witnessed forces beyond doctrine. The Iron Throne, once the axis of the world, lost its singular importance. History did not stop. It softened. This is where the timeline of Westeros ends, not with closure, but with quiet acceptance. The understanding that cycles exist, that progress is temporary, that memory fades unless tended carefully. The oldest lesson, first learned in the Dawn Age, finally reasserted itself. The world does not belong to any one people, dynasty, or belief. It tolerates them for a time. Fire rises. Ice follows. Stories form in the space between, offering meaning where certainty cannot exist. And when the stories end, what remains is not resolution, but rest. A long breath taken after centuries of tension. A pause in the turning of the wheel. A moment where the world, having remembered what it is capable of losing, chooses, quietly, to continue. not toward glory, not toward destiny, but forward slowly into whatever dawn comes next.